1967. Tonight, Greg Thompson is going to talk about Brigham Madsen, who was a legendary professor of history at the University of Utah. He was a prodigious scholar, but he also did lots of other things, and Greg's going to talk about Brig. The next month, we're going to have another presentation on another somebody. We talked about Hal Schindler. We'll see who we come up with and who we have as a speaker. Maybe we'll have somebody like Will Bagley talk about Hal Schindler, assuming everybody's good with that. You should also note that the newsletter is expanded. We've got Steve Berlin has included this month a column from Hal Schindler, one of his historical columns. Will Bagley's done a lot of those. We'll have Will Bagley columns. Steve has also included an article by Leonard Arrington from the early 1990s about the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, which seems particularly timely right now. So, you know, lots of things to read in the newsletter. I want to thank Steve, who really spearheaded trying to do this electronically and keep us together. It's hard not to see each other. It'll be nice when we can go back to meeting with each other at the Alta Club. In the meantime, we hope this is helpful. Steve's also the person who has masterminded the materials in the newsletter. Also, I want to thank Craig Smith, who went to the bother and time to figure out the logistics of getting an expanded Zoom program app for Westerners. Zoom, just the thing you can get off the internet, is limited to 40 minutes and 15 or 20 participants. So we got a relatively inexpensive upgraded Zoom, so we can have up to 100 people. We can talk as long as we want. One of the things we're considering doing is making our monthly presentations, even when we do get back together, available to corresponding members around the country, like Dan Johnson, and also to record them. So if somebody misses, they could watch it afterwards as well. We're going to have Greg Thompson talk for 20 or 30 minutes. We'll have question and answers after that. We'll have a social period after that, which will be interesting to see how it works with you know, on Zoom. It occurred to me we hadn't asked anyone to introduce Greg. He probably doesn't need any introduction, but Greg, I did a little bit of research because I didn't see any. I was hiding. Didn't see not having that. And so I'm going to give a brief introduction of our own Greg Thompson, who probably doesn't need an introduction in this group, but I'm going to give one anyway. Greg is the Associate Dean of Special Collections at the Marriott Library at the University of Utah, University Archivist, University Historian. He teaches graduate history courses on archives and manuscripts. He's published and edited a number of books, lots of articles, more lectures. He's a winner of many prestigious awards. He was made a Fellow of the Utah Historical Society last summer. He's a noted scholar on archives and library management, on Native American history, on the history of skiing, and lots of others, I have no doubt. He serves on many academic, history, and other boards. He has been a member of Utah Westerners since 1972. Is that actually true, Greg?
That's correct, I believe. Somewhere in there.
That's pretty darn close to 1967. He is, we all know and love Greg, and he has it's been wonderful for me getting to know him better on the board. I'm sure Greg has served on the board 50 times since 1972. He's currently the Vice President of the Utah Westerners, and he has been gracious enough on short notice to prepare to talk about Brigham Madsen, which will be, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you for that most generous introduction. I hope everyone can hear me all right. Sound check. I'm delighted to try to do this evening, although it makes me a little nervous. I've been spending a lot of Zoom time these days, as we all have, but it's still always a trip into no-no land when you start in on Zoom. I would also like to acknowledge our Zoom masters, Steve and Craig and Ken, for putting this together, and to thank them for bringing us together in this way. I parallel Ken's thinking. We're going to be a while before we're back in the Alta Club, and we certainly don't want our Utah Westerners to dissolve into thin air. So thank you. I'm pleased to be asked to talk a little bit about Brigham Madsen. There are some people on the Zoom call today that probably know Brig better than I. I first met Brig in about 1967, I think, and over a variety of situations and events and activities, and some as a role in the role of student. Got to know Brig and greatly admire him. I would like to spend a little bit of time, and I'm watching my clock closely here, to introduce to those of you who didn't get the opportunity to meet Brig and don't know too much about him. I'll try to give you some background in his career and life, and then we'll talk a little bit about his publications. I really would like to focus on an aspect of Brig's career that isn't talked about too much, but led to an important part of his career that is talked about. And that is his involvement as an expert historian and consultant for in expert witness style for the Shoshone-Bannock tribe located in Fort Hall. We all know that. And how that led to some very interesting efforts by Brig in publishing. And we had kind of the inside story on how that began, and so I'll try to share that with you. I'd like to start by acknowledging that when you look at Brigham Madsen, you look at an individual that probably had 4 major careers wrapped into one human package. And in every one of those, he was quite successful. He was born October 21st, 1914 in Magna, Utah. And not too after, about 3 years after that, his family moved to Pocatello, Idaho, where his father, having been in the construction and continuing to be in the construction business, moved his professional career and began to help to build Pocatello in the time of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and so on. Brig went through school in Pocatello. He graduated from Pocatello High School in 1932, and he immediately enrolled in what was known then as the University of Idaho Southern Extension. Now we know it as Idaho State University. And at the time that he went there, it was a junior college or an AC college. And he writes in his memoir, and it sounds like some of you have looked at that or read it, that he had to borrow $10 from the college to enroll. That was the cost of tuition. And his father had to sign for it as a loan. And now you think of our students at the U spending about $8,600 and a year on tuition, and our out-of-state students about, I think, Marnie, about 25,000, 24,000. So times are relevant and times are hard, it seems. He graduated in 2 years, he graduated from Idaho State with a certificate, an AC associate degree certificate in education and he immediately entered the LDS missionary program and was sent to the central southern eastern coast region of the missionary program. There, for 2 years, he functioned as a very successful missionary. He, in his 2 years, he was in the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, Virginia, and North Carolina. He went in 1934. By 1935, he had risen to the role of president of the Eastern North Carolina district. And by the end of 1936, and when he came home, he, in addition to having been an administrator within the mission, he also built two what he refers to as church buildings. I assume they were ward houses, and that was paralleled his strength in growing up as working with his father in the profession of construction, and he became very skilled ultimately in construction. And so the appropriate missionary leadership took good advantage of his skills, and by the time he left southeastern United States and came back to Pocatello, he was noted for his both administrative and construction skills. He immediately upon returning, 1936, enrolled in the University of Utah as with his associate degree in place, and he signed up to major in history. Strange thing. And he minored in sociology. His history had been nurtured by his experiences, and he had the opportunity to study under two important faculty members at the university, Harold Dalglish. I think I actually took a class from Harold in my graduate days in the latter part of his career, and Andrew Neff. The importance of studying both was that Brig, and you'll see this as we go along, develops an important sense of what he views as his history principles, and they tend to be broad, they tend to be in the larger view, and they focus down to the local, not forgetting what the larger picture is. Neff, the importance of Neff, in addition to being a fine historian of the time, was a Bolton-trained historian from UC California, Berkeley. And as we go through this, I'm going to have to hurry along here. I'm going to be pokey. As we go through this, hopefully you'll see that Brig is influenced heavily by the Bolton School of Greater American history, the concept of the history of the Americas as one. And I'll try to point some of that out. So it starts with Neff, and it grows on. While at the University of Utah, he meets Betty McAllister, who becomes Betty Madsen shortly after Brig graduates from the University of Utah, which he did in '38. And he graduated in history and with a teaching certificate. Interestingly enough, there's actually a year in between meeting Betty, graduating, and then getting married. He took a job, and I love this. He took a job in Pingree, Idaho. Now, I didn't look up Pingree, but I think it's slightly north of the Fort Hall Reservation. Some of you more familiar with Idaho may may correct my geography there. So he took a job as teacher and principal. Now, he just graduated from the University of Utah, and he not only was he administering the place, and that's an important part of his concept, but he taught. His teaching day ran like this. He taught English, world history, business methods, public speaking, algebra, and geometry. Now, I did public secondary school teaching. If I'd have had a schedule like that, they'd have hauled me out feet first. I don't think I could have ever managed that in addition to running the place. But he did. He did it for a year. And then he marries Betty in August of 1939 on one day, and the next day they are on the train headed to Berkeley, where he had been accepted to be a graduate student, a master's student at UC Berkeley. And they arrive, they settle in, and Brigg begins his master's effort. He had hoped that he would be able to do a master's in a year. He almost did. He worked under a couple of professors that I'll point out that are quite significant in historiography and the world of historians, particularly Western. Lawrence Kinnaird, I think is how he said. I always try to say Kinnaird, but I think it was Kinnaird, who was also a Bolton student himself, became the chief mentor for Brigg at Berkeley in his master's program. And he also worked with Frederick Logan Paxson, who was a Frederick Jackson Turner's student. And together, those two people were pretty influential on the career of Brigham Madsen. His thesis for his master's degree was entitled The Early History of the Upper Snake River Valley. Can we see a trend beginning to build here? He finished his master's in 1940 and immediately in the fall started his PhD program at Berkeley, working under Kinnaird. And he also worked, actually got to study under Herbert Bolton himself. Bolton had been in retirement, came out of retirement because of the war and the period of time after the war when so many students, GIs, hit the campuses. So he had the opportunity to actually work with Bolton. It's an important part, I think, of his career. He completed his dissertation in 1948, and it was entitled, the book that we know well from him, The Bannock Indians of Northwest History, 1805 to 1900. Of course, that's the basis for his first publication, The Bannocks of Idaho, and published by Paxton Printers. Brigg moved two things that are important. Brigg continued to work construction all the way through his Berkeley time. He would work summers, often with his father back in Idaho, and that's what supported the family. By the time he had graduated, he and Betty had two children, including David Madsen, who some of us have heard talk at Utah Westerners. He was the first state anthropologist, archaeologist, and a wonderful, talented anthropologist. Subsequently, Betty and Brigg had two other children. His first position was at Brigham Young University, and he took the position in 1949. He lasted until 1954. In the middle of that period, Ernest Wilkinson became president, and there was a bit of a friction between Brigg as the history professor and Wilkinson as the president. And Brigg chose to part ways. And he left for a period of 7 years to become a significant member of his father and his uncle's construction company. They had been operating in Pocatello and then came down into Salt Lake. And Brigg told me at one time in that period of 7 years, they were doing 50 houses at one time in construction. They were a pretty big operation. And Brigg not only helped with the construction end, but he had helped to administer the operations. So he really missed the intellectual and academic climate. He, and the timing was right, that he takes a position of, which turns out to be 1 year, 1961 to 64, to be an instructor at Utah State University. It's important to note his time there because he actually, I'm sorry, I said 1 year. It was actually 3 years to 1964. While he was there, and he replaced Ev Cooley, another founding member of Westerners, and who went from USU to become director of the Utah Historical Society. He became involved in Peace Corps and taught summer programs for 1 year. He was in Iran, and he was then in Washington, D.C., and he actually left USU to become a full-time member of the Kennedy administration and the Peace Corps program in Washington, D.C. Later, by 1965, he became the founding director of training for the Volunteers in Service to America, VISTA. Dan Johnson, who's on with us, was a VISTA member for 2 years in the Greater Four Corners area in our region and knows that program well. So at the end of that, Brigg is offered a position at the University of Utah. He takes it. He moves through from being dean to being administrative vice president, where he oversaw a number of buildings that were built in the latter part of the 60s and early 70s under James Fletcher, the president of the University of Utah, and later director of NASA twice. Great man. And Brigg really made a strong contribution to the university's campus. And he continued to build his administrative skills and the recognition of his talents in that area. He also continued to teach all along. It's in that time period that I got to know Brigg. I suspect I first met him in 1967. I can't remember for sure, but I know that he would take on students. I first met him in the classroom in 1968 when Floyd O'Neill and myself were running a 2-week program for teachers coming back for certification for secondary credit. And the program actually was David Miller's program. He put it together, but his wife had developed cancer and he couldn't take on the task. So it fell to Floyd, and I was the gopher. And Brigg came in and lectured for most of a day. And it was fascinating to hear him. As those of you who knew Brigg, he wrote his lectures and he wrote them as a story. He was famous for the way he would position them as they'd have a start, they'd have a middle, and they'd have a conclusion. They would be a unit. And he was so masterful at reading his lectures, you never knew he was reading his lectures. And I think we experienced some of that in the Westerners. He moved from administrative vice president to being director of the library after a failed directorship search. He did that for 2 years, 71 to 73. And that's the beginning of the other part of the story. After he left the directorship, he became chair of the history department, was supposed to be for 2 years. He wrangled out after one and in each of these stops, he makes significant changes. He is a reform-minded administrator. He looks for efficiency and he gains it. In 1984, he retires from teaching history. And for the period of 1984 to 2010, when he dies on December 24th, at the age of 96, he takes on what is the last part of his significant careers. And that is, he truly becomes a writing, publishing, and lecturing historian. And we'll spend a few minutes at looking at that. In 1973, I got a call from his accountant, Richard Denman, who was a force in his own right. And Richard said, would you come in and meet Brigg? He wants to talk to you. And I thought, oh Christ, what have I done now? I hung out in the library a lot and had a carol at the time. And so I knew Brigg. I'd gotten to know him more and more. And Brigg, so I went in to see Brigg, and Brigg sat me down and he said, Thompson, I'm taking on the role of a historian, advisor, and expert witness for the Shoshone-Bannock tribe. What he went on to tell me was that he had been working with Francis Horn, a major attorney and lawyer, for the firm of Wilkinson, Cragen, and Barker. Now, it's the same Wilkinson as Ernie Wilkinson, of which he was crossing swords with at BYU 12 years or so earlier. Wilkinson wasn't really too involved in those days with the firm, but Barker was, and Barker was the Indian connection with Francis Horn. And they had come to Brigg because he was the leading expert on the Shoshone-Bannock Indians. Brigg, and he told me this, he protested, he didn't want to do it. He was white and felt that the Shoshone should have one of their own members be acting in the role, and said, no, I won't do it. And they came back and they said, you've got to. And he met with the tribal council, Fort Hall, and everybody leaned on him pretty hard, and he took on the role. Well, once he had the role, then he had to start getting ready to do it. Now, he was still, in 73, he was still at the library and yet to be the chair of the history department and a continuing professor of history until he retired in 84. So he had worked some deals out, as only Brigg could, to be able to do this. Well, the first thing that needed to happen was he needed to be introduced to the National Archives Record Group 75 on Pennsylvania Avenue, 9th Street, where the American Indian records are held for the federal government and the tribes, tribal agencies. And Brigg called, I'm sure this is the way it went. Brigg talked to Ev Cooley. By then, Ev had left the state history and was developing special collections at the Marriott Library, working for Brigg. Another Bolton student, by the way. And they said, well, you got to get O'Neill involved. I'm sure Brig talked to Greg Crampton, and Crampton, I'm sure, said that. Probably talked to Lyman Tyler, S. Lyman Tyler, by then was also on the campus and had been director of the Harold B. Lee Library and really put that library on the page, and and was an Indian scholar trained by Crampton. So, you know, it's a small group. And so Ev and Brig and Greg all pushed, I think, Brig to get Floyd involved. So Floyd said he would do it, and said you need to bring Thompson along. By that time, I'd had about 5 years of working in the National Archives, and we had we'd go sometimes 4 times a year to work on American Indian tribal records. So my experience ran like this, and I think I have a few minutes left, and then we'll get through this. Brig called me in, and they worked out some kind of financial arrangement so I could survive during the summer, because I was continuing to be a graduate student, had finished my master's by then, and was working on my PhD. And so the agreement was set, and I was back in the American West Center, and I got a call from Betty Madsen. By that time, Betty had become the thesis editor for the University of Utah, and everybody with a master's degree, a master's thesis, and a dissertation had to go through Betty and have it approved, and she was tough. And I get this call one afternoon, and she said, Greg, this is Betty. Would you come down and see me? And I thought, uh-oh. I mean, when you got called to her office, you were in trouble. And I thought, I don't know what I did. But anyway, I went down. So Betty sat me down, and she said, now, here's the way you're going to run Brig when you get him to Washington, D.C. Brig had heart problems for a number of years. Through a lot of his life. He was tall, very tall, as you know, and his health was a bit shaky at times. Said you can't let him overwork, and you can't walk him very much. You got to be really careful. And so the agreement I had with Brig was that I was Betty's voice in going through this initiative. Working in the Federal Archives is hard work. You begin at about 8:30 in the morning, and you work till about 10 o'clock at night, and you do that 6 days a week. And then on the weekends, you go to the Library of Congress, and you work their sources. So we took Brig off the LC routine. Brig did fine, and that effort resulted in 7,000 documents being pulled, 25,000 pages of Shoshone history being copied, microfilmed, and otherwise duplicated. And that became the foundation for 5 of Brig's important books, of the 11 or so that he publishes from the period of 1973 to about 2000, 1999, in there somewhere. And the books that Brig did are some that I think most of you have read. He was very masterful and always the administrator. So he organizes a research team of graduate students that help him organize 25,000 pages. And he begins to pump out titles and publications. He had originally, the one book that he had done of note for us, The Bannock of Idaho, which was published by Caxton in 1958, there had been a couple of little things that he did before, but in 1980, he publishes 3 major books that helped to form the foundation of his Shoshone historiography. The first was the Lemhi Sacagawea's People, also by Caxton. The second was the Northern Shoshone, published by Caxton, 1980. And the third was a book that he was the most proud of, and that was North to Montana, that was co-authored by Betty and himself. And he felt that that book, published by the University of Utah Press in 1980, was also was one of the most significant books they did. He felt it changed the direction of Western historiography, and I suspected that he did. He also brought out very shortly thereafter Corinne, the Gentile Capital of Utah, published by the Utah State Historical Society. And he goes on, the book that you had, Ken, 49er in Utah, I believe, came out and was a published work by the Tanner Trust Fund. The Tanner Trust Fund is a library publishing fund that Brigg, Sterling McMurrin, and Ev Cooley put together with O.C. Tanner. Still exists, and I haven't been as active as Ev has been, but we have published from it. He also publishes the Gold Rush Sojourners in the Great Salt Lake City, 1849 and 1850, published by the U Press in 83. He publishes the Shoshone Frontier and the Bear River Massacre by the University of Utah Press in 85, and Chief Pocatello, the White Plume, that's the title, by the University of Utah Press in 86. In 89, he edits Exploring the Great Salt Lake City, which was a major work and a reprint with a new forward and editing by Brigg. That was done in 89 by the U Press, and the Tanner Funds put money behind that. He then publishes Glory Hunter, a biography of Patrick Edwards Connor by the University of Utah Press in 1990. Now, stepping back just a little bit, Brigg and Betty were always active with the church, and especially through the period when their kids were being raised, and they held positions, both of them. And he had an interest in Mormon theology and Mormon history. One of the most interesting books that he edited was entitled B.H. Roberts. It was by B.H. Roberts, Studies of the Book of Mormon, and it was published by the University of Illinois Press in 1985. So it falls in this period of extraordinary production. And that book sold and reprinted and sold. The royalties for that book came to Special Collections, and we still are building a little bit of revenue from it, but we don't get enough so they actually pay us. But they're still selling books after 25 years of activity on that book. There are other books that he's involved in. He does a ton of articles. He's honored as a, I think I mentioned he was made a fellow of the Society of Utah Society's State History. And he published his final major work, his memoirs, Against the Grain. And I think somewhere the Craig or Steve may have the Gittins work, and so we could take a look at it. The portrait on the dust cover is a Gittins, and it was commissioned by Fletcher, President Fletcher, for his work and contributions to the University of Utah. And it hangs in the Winder Seminar or conference room on the second floor of the Park Building as we talk today. Brig was an amazing individual during this period when he was publishing so much, and he had pretty much retired from his role in history. We set him up in a carrel on the 5th floor of the Marriott Library. He would come about 8 o'clock every morning, and he would work till 12. You could set your clock by him, and it's this period when he puts out this enormous amount of production of writing history. And all the while he's giving talks, and he does some other smaller works. One of the works that he does in this time period is he did a work for the Utah Westerners called The Craft of History, published by Prairie Dog Press, Will Bagley's press, for the Westerners. And I hadn't thought about it for a long time until I was looking around. I thought, oh my God, we should pull that back up and perhaps resurrect it for the more contemporary members of Utah history. Now, I've talked well beyond my time, as I suspected I might. So thank you for indulging me. I learned a ton from Brig. The time I spent in Washington, D.C. was about 10, 12 days straightforward. And I just think the time I was with him was precious, and my directed readings was a lot of fun. We can talk about that maybe later. Thank you so much for your patience, and I hope this has been successful for you.
Thank you, Greg. That was very interesting. If you have questions, as I'm sure some of you will, just unmute, ask your question, and then if you need repartee, stay unmuted. If you don't, then just mute yourself back up. Does anyone have questions for Greg?
Hello, Mr. Westwood. Put you all to sleep, I can tell.
No, sir. No, I think you did very well. I think it was wonderful. I was surprised at a number of things, one of which I had no idea that he had gone off for 7 years. During those 7 years, you would have thought he would have fallen off the academic map entirely. How did you say he got into Washington, and how did he get into Vista? What was that segue?
So if you may know that in the 60s, the Utah State University, as our land grant school, was heavily involved in training Peace Corps volunteers and working in areas outside the country on summer programs. Very active, and he kind of naturally fell into it, replacing Ev Cooley in the history department, it was a natural for him. I talked about his 4 careers. Well, he had a career in construction. He had a career in history. He had an administrative career running numerous organizations. And he had a career raising a successful family. And so the first year, the first summer that he was at USU after the end of the academic year, he was asked to take on instruction and teaching for the Peace Corps volunteers in Iran.
I understand Utah State sent quite a few people to Iran.
They did. They, with their expertise in high elevation, dry climate water, they were priceless to the Shah and to Iran.
They also had the international. They also had the International Sheep and Goat Institute in Iran that they ran.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh,
Especially those Navajo goats or sheep.
It's almost impossible to encapsulate Brigham Madsen's influence and career. But Greg didn't even mention that Brig essentially redesigned the campus. And the reason that you've got the campus divided up as it is because Madsen supervised the reconfiguration. And he also missed that Brig was a captain in Patton's Third Army. And I'm not sure if he made it over during the war, but I believe he attended the Nuremberg trials as a historian.
Well, in both of those, I kind of cut it because I was running out of, I overran my time. But on the campus, Brig absolutely did help create the master plan. And so the two major walkways through the campus, the one that runs north-south past the Marriott Library and the Library Plaza, and the other one that runs east-west from the Behavioral Science Building up through what now is the Honors Dorm, thanks to Marty, were his designs. And he also is the one that built in the burrs on the campus as you walk through it. A fun story that I should tell you is that he was doing all this under Jim Fletcher. And James Fletcher was quite the president, got to know him reasonably well. And Fletcher kept saying to Brig, because Brig was just down the hall from him, so they start building the Behavioral Sciences building. It is the perfect example on our campus of visual environmental pollution. And Fletcher was watching this thing go up. It goes 11 or 13 floors. I've forgotten what it is.
Windowless.
And it's concrete.
It's British. What's it? There's a brutalism. British brutalism.
Yeah. Well, it's damn brutal.
It was very forward thinking at that moment in time.
Very progressive. Actually, I'm fond of it. So don't diss it too hard.
So Fletcher kept saying to Brig, so what kind of skin wrap is this building going to have on it? And Brig would hem and haw, and he'd tell the story. It's so much fun. And he said, I finally had to own up to the fact that, Jim, you get what you see. That's the building. And Marty's absolutely right. She is the architect in the group, as is Brad. He's deep in that area. It was a movement. And that was one of the first major buildings on our campus in that movement. Brig was also responsible for the Huntsman Center, the Hyper Center. He had a hand in the Marriott Libraries building at that time that comes online during his period. And so he was a major force. And it was so much fun for me because by the time I went to I got to the Marriott Library and took on the roles I did, I had this wonderful background that Brig had taught me about the campus and its contemporary 20th century development. And so it gave me a real ace in the hole. I did omit, and I didn't mean to, Will, that he not only he went into the Army in '43 as a private, and he came through and he landed up I think on the West Coast, training and administering, two important terms in Brig's career. And he didn't go to Europe during the war, but he went after, and he became the chief historian for Patton's army. And it's in that role how he got to Nuremberg and was involved. And to hear him talk about that was just amazing.
Yeah.
So,
hi,
Roy. How are you?
Good.
Roy got to know. Is Walter on? Roy and Walter got to know Brig quite well.
I did. He was a real mentor to me, and I credit a couple of my books to him. But in his papers in special collections, is like huge scrapbooks that he created of Patton's. It's got operational plans and photographs and just all kinds of stuff that he created as the Third Army historian.
It goes along with a wonderful diary he kept during his war years. He always kept a diary. He was a great diary, as was Ev Cooley, diarist. And his war diary probably should be published.
I wanted to take credit for him being a great teacher. He was a great teacher of mine, and there are plenty of people in the Zoom room who are students of his as well. Marty and Greg and I were in classes together, and a wonderful memory.
He was a mentor. He was a mentor's mentor.
I always said he reminded me of Moses because of his appearance, but he also is, you wanted to excel when you were a student of his. You wanted to do well because you didn't want to disappoint him, because he was such a great teacher and a great mentor to all of us, and you just had to do well. That was the requirement.
You especially had to do well if you had Betty looking over your shoulder.
Well, that's right.
Oh, two people that need mentioning are Sterling McMurrin and Dale Morgan, because exploring the Great Salt Lake, and I think one or two of Briggs' other books were essentially, they weren't reprints, they were
edits.
They were documentary histories that paralleled published federal documents. And I depended on that book.
Hi, Kurt.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
I've enjoyed this a lot. I wanted to just say, if there are people, any Westerners out there that would like a copy of his memoirs, Against the Grain, I'd be happy to just send it to them. If they would just pay for the postage, I'll give it to them for free, because it's a great book. He was a great guy. I use the term for him, the perfect term is one we've heard before, and that's gentleman and a scholar. And anyway, I'm not trying to commercialize because I'm not going to make anything. But anyway, I'd be
that's all right. We'll let you.
Up to, I've got several copies. If somebody wants one, just email us or call us, and I'll send it out to you. But we all need to know Brigham Madsen. If we didn't already, we can get to know him by reading what he wrote.
I miss Brigham Madsen and having his involvement. It was wonderful for those of us that were in special collections during the most of I don't know, must have been a decade plus where he hung out with us. And you're absolutely right, Kurt. He just was a wonderful gentleman and an exceptional scholar. He talked about, and he talks about in his book, that he felt that history should be written in good narrative form. It should be communicative in its nature, and it shouldn't be minimalized by jargon. And he talked about the idea of how you tell a story. He's a great storyteller, and he practiced that. You can see it in these books as you go through it. He just absolutely practiced that, and it was so much fun for us in special collections. We would the law of the land in special collections was you never bothered Briggs when he went into his carrel. You could talk to him before he got in. You could talk to him afterwards, but don't go rattling on the door. And I think he quite enjoyed hanging with us in special collections.
And Briggs led the fight to get women into the Westerners.
Yeah, oh, there's another part of that. I'm glad you brought that up, Will. He actually helped form a women's Westerners group in Salt Lake City. I can't remember the years. You may know, Roy, but I know that Briggs and Catherine McKay and I think Meg
Judy
Brady.
Dykeman.
What?
Judy Dykeman.
Yeah. Anyway, it lasted.
Leonard Arrington. Wasatch Westerners.
Yeah. It was. It ran what, Will, about 3 years.
No, it ran about 10 years.
Did it?
Yeah.
It met at Lamb's Cafe, and it was fun. It got a little much trying to go to 2 Westerners group a month, but you know, we tried hard. Marty, I know you have a lot of stories.
Officers Club at Fort Douglas.
Pardon?
It actually met at the Officers Club at Fort Douglas.
Did it?
Yep.
They he speaks very fondly of you, Marty, in his book, in his memoirs. He thought so much of you.
Had a great love for him. One thing that no one's mentioned is he was a wonderful letter writer. I have folders and folders of letters that he has written me at different times in my life. Whenever something big happened or when I had hard times, he would write letters of encouragement, and it was like he was helping to build a narrative around things that happened to me and help me remember the meaning in it. He was a dear man.
He also, with Shauna O'Neill's on the Zoom list here. He also worked with Shauna in 1973. Shauna had just taken the position as director of county aging for the Salt Lake County, and Brig joined her advisory committee, and mentions that in his memoirs, and very fondly remembers Shauna and the role she played there. Thanks, Shauna.
You know, I remember about his time as an administrator at the University of Utah that I remember him telling, and loved to hear about, when there was a big student protest during the Vietnam War and the students were all marching to the campus and they were going to occupy the park building. And James Fletcher took one look at that and he said, "How you handle it, Brig?" Because he was the provost, I think, right?
He
and
was.
So Fletcher went out the door.
No, he was administrative vice president.
Administrative vice president.
Uh-huh.
So Fletcher went out the back door and left Brig to handle it, and he did, very well.
You know, some of you have forgotten the fact that he went on to help us as Westerners on at least 1 or 2 field trips into northern Utah and southern Idaho. You recall those?
Yes,
I do. He wrote an article called Almo, the massacre that didn't happen.
Right.
I don't know if you could see that, but that's part of his memoir, and he talks about that in his beginning part of his chapter as a writer at work. And I remember, I was on that field trip, and I remember Rig talking about it. I had no idea what he was talking about. There were 2 things on that trip: the City of Rocks I'd never been to, and Almo. And I'm going, what in the world is this? And it was, it was a serious issue for that community.
You thought it was the Sesame Street character, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
They had a big monument to a massacre by the Shoshone in 1863 of 300 white settlers. And it was entirely fabricated by a member of the Almo Chamber of Commerce. And Brig meticulously deconstructed how it happened.
The other thing I didn't give enough time and credit to for Brig was the role he played in the Bear River Massacre, and the entitling that event accordingly, and the development, laying the foundation for the development to a national monument status and recognition that it has today. I can remember when he came to a luncheon, I think was with Ev and myself and Brig. Lyman might have been there, and he started talking about this, and this was pretty early in his work, and boy, he was so skilled at how he managed that with the tribe and with the national parks and with the people in southern Idaho. It was an interesting, I don't think he does justice on his own contribution in his own memoir, quite frankly, for that.
He told me his proudest accomplishment as a historian was to change the Battle of Bear River into the Bear River Massacre.
Right, right.
Well, thank you. We've been at it an hour and 2 minutes. I'm sure everybody's getting tired of.
Well, thank you, Greg.
Yeah, that was great.
Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Greg.
A lot of fun. I enjoyed doing it. It was quick. We only had about 10 days, but
Yeah,
Great job, Greg.
you did a great job.
trying to manage 300 people that are on. Hi, Mike. Good to see you. On extended leave and home duty is turning out to be quite a challenge. So I spend a lot of time on Zoom meetings and trying to solve problems.
Love the hat. Looks great.
Yeah.
That's my
Thanks, Greg.
summer Stetson.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. It was fabulous, Greg.
Thanks,
you.
everybody. You're very kind, and I enjoyed having the opportunity.
Good job, Greg.
Thanks, organizers.
Hi, Forrest. There was Forrest Kutch. How are you? Welcome to
wonderful.
Westerners, my friend.
I'm wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Dan, are you still with us, or did you go to sleep?
No, I'm still with you.
All right.
Great. I need to follow up with you about the Shoshone and the new perspective that he brought. I would love to talk about that.
We'll do it. Thanks for joining, and best DeFay.
Yeah.
Hello, Mr. DeFay. You were pretty quiet.
He's still pretty quiet.
Yeah. Could you hear me, Gino?
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah.
Hi. How are you? Thanks for coming in. See, we got Ken. We got quite a few of those outliers.
We got Craig. What was the final number?
47.
48. No.
47?
48. 48.
Been a
that's
nice time to get
respectable.
together. We'll do the same thing again next month. Feel free to stay on for a little while if you want to try to mingle a little bit, and we'll be back in touch next month.
You say there were 48 or 47?
48.
48. Very good.
You know, if I may, for those of us that are corresponding members, once this insanity of the virus goes away, we ought to do this at least once a year.
Yeah, we may do it more than that. We may include people who can't show up otherwise to do that. We just don't want people to not come.
Sure. Sure.
By the way, if you could remind dummies that live in other states what time zone they're in, I could have attended the whole thing.
Sorry.
Yeah, I want to thank you guys for putting this together. You did a great job.
Well, it's Ken and Steve and
Craig.
Laura helped with this.
Laura.
Yeah, it's they're the brain trust that make things happen.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good to see everybody, and I'm especially pleased to see our friends from outside the Great Zion Curtain.
Absolutely.
One of Brigg and Sterling's forgotten accomplishments is that they were responsible for Jack Welch creating farms. It doesn't seem like anybody wants to hear more about that, but they did.
Oh, go for it, Will.
Okay, Sterling and Brigg were great friends, and Sterling joined the Westerners in about 1995 for a while. But and they had collaborated on studies of the Book of Mormon, which was a tremendously enlightening book for me, and it evoked a angry reaction at Brigham Young University. And Jack Welch authored a typically ad hominem attack on the qualities of scholarship of Sterling McMurrin and Brigham Madsen. And Sterling wrote most of the replies, And he was absolutely brilliant at pointing out that all the things that Welch had charged them with, they did not do. And they did not make the claims that Welch asserted that they did make. But I think Jack saw a big money opportunity here. And it's all in manuscript, and I've got the files, but it's probably too late to try to put a book together on it. Hey, Madsen.
It's only 8 o'clock.
Hi, Steve.
Howdy, gentlemen.
Have you been here the whole time?
No, I've been here about 10 minutes.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you all too. I'm down here in Mesquite. And just to let you know, like the field trip would have been starting this weekend, and it's going to be 95 degrees. And I think
not up at the field trip. It's going to be cold up yonder.
Well,
it would start in May.
I think up in Beaver Dam Wash, we probably would have been successful. It's just been a little bit warm when we got down to Mesquite and have to hang around the swimming pool.
Well, this is why I was sort of hoping that we could do a virtual tour for the field trip and get some of our Southern Utah members to go out and show some of the landscapes. Maybe we can.
Maybe we can. I'll be back.
Jim DeFay, it's good to see you. Jim lives around the block, 2 blocks over, and I hardly ever see him.
Well, it's the problem, you know. Back we're all for
the working class.
In our neighborhood are people walking dogs like you and Karen.
Yep. Get my 3 miles in every
Here's the
day.
new tool in my arsenal that I was going to bring on the field trip.
Starship Gallons.
Repairing it after the last epic crash. But yeah, I'm now the drone man, so field trips will include a drone. And typical of me, I bought one, I crashed it, and now I had to buy all these parts from a guy, and now I'm going to have 2 of them starting tomorrow. But there's my destroyed camera that I'm working on right now.
Steve, is there any toy that you don't have?
Yeah, there's some yeah, we won't go there.
Okay.
Hello, Larry.
How you doing, Steve? Good to see you.
Good, and it's nice to see Dennis DeFay, by God. How you doing, Dennis?
I'm doing well,
Dino?
Steve. I'm doing well. It's good to see you.
And I saw Brad there a second ago. Wonderful. And Greg, say hi to everybody. How many people are actually on the field?
47.
31 now, it says.
Oh, shit. Oh,
Pretty good list.
God, I would have combed my hair.
Yeah.
So am I the only one, or is there, Dr. Hatch did it too, but we both read The Great Influenza, which everybody ought to read.
Yeah.
Barry.
Yeah.
By Barry. What's his first name? Is it John Barry?
John Barry. Who else has read it? Who else here has read it? Yeah. I'm rereading it.
It's the current map for what should be being followed, but nobody knows how to read.
That's a great book, though. Steve put me on it. It's Joe Hatch, and it's a fabulous book.
Hey, you guys should also read the articles in the Quarterly. There's a couple of them about the 1918 flu, and there's so many things that it seems like
I watched it the other night.
Well, I want to give some credit to the University of Utah Press, which has just released Thunder Go North, The Hunt for Sir Francis Drake's Fair and Good Bay. And for those of us who have been fascinated by the whole fabrication of the plate of brass, this is brilliant.
Hold it still, Will, and lift it up so you can see the author. Got to see, lift it up more. So
Yeah, no
no
spoilers, Will.
You can't spoil this story. I'll turn on more light.
It really, I read it too. Reba Ralph from the press sent it to me.
Yeah.
And it is really good. I mean, it changes your view of Western historiography.
Yes.
As you're talking about, Greg, quite a bit.
And
was
it
a real
doesn't,
surprise. I'm still gobsmacked.
it does not flatter Bolton.
No spoilers.
The light behind it doesn't show up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We lost you. And whenever you
What's
did, you went dark on us.
Tell us the title again.
Thunder Go North. And it's also
Hold
in
it
a-
still.
It's an unusual title for the U Press. When it came through at the faculty advisory committee, it twisted a few heads.
I want to know the backstory. How did you get this fantastic book?
I don't know that story, Will.
Ask Reba.
Yeah. Because I think she shepherded it through the process. She's about to retire, and I can't. I'm having a hard time getting the current crop of administrators to understand what a loss that's going to be.
And this archaeologist, anthropologist, the best anthropologists I know are all women. It's staggering.
Is that your dog, DeFay?
It is. Yeah, that's
Karen's taken our dog under supervision so I could get through this without too many barks.
so. Well, we have 4 of them.
Oh, look at that. All right.
That's the hound dog.
Yeah. Named?
Emma.
Emma. Would that be Emma Smith?
No, Emma Lou.
What's Gallinson building right there now? What are you building there, Gallinson?
I'm fixing my crashed drone.
His camera for his drone.
$350, thought it was a good deal because it's used, and now I bought $1,000 worth of parts.
Was that a cat? Were I?
Hey, but I sold my Exxon stock 5 days ago, so you know.
Yeah.
Good timing.
Otherwise, you would have to pay them to sell it.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think the minus $1.36 if you buy it includes the barrel?
No, you have to store it yourself.
If it does, you're $25 to the good.
I know. Yeah, yeah.
I've
sure enjoyed a lot of your Facebook posts there, Mr. Webb. You've done a good job.
Thanks. Something to do.
Yeah, we all look for something to do. I've been playing golf, you know, I can socially distance doing that. And I've been chasing petroglyphs just to make Keith mad. Did I see Keith Fessenden on this?
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
I don't know who's, let's see. I think Ken probably had to leave. Did Craig leave?
No, I'm here. I'm going to turn the meeting off.
I'm going to have to run. I held up dinner at my house so we could get this in, and everybody's beginning to protest.
Yeah, sorry I was late. I was also on the wrong time zone. But I started my cocktail hour.
Well, you can go. It's recorded, so you can go back into it, Steve.
Yeah, I've been visiting with all the grandkids using Zoom and stuff. It's been good. It's been helpful.
Well, thanks everybody. It was fun to do, and it's great to see all the faces, and especially for those of you outside of Salt Lake and our area. I think we've latched on to something that might be a good trick to
I agree.
perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Greg.
Yeah,
Oh, my
thanks,
pleasure.
Greg.
Thanks to
Greg.
Craig.
Good job,
and
Thanks for everyone attending.
everybody take care. Be safe.
Wash your hands.
And be sequestered.
Okay, I'm going to turn the meeting off.
All right.
All right.
Adios.
Thanks, Greg. See you guys.
Thank you, guys. Great to see you.
See ya.